Good morning to everybody. This piece is not as exciting as everything else we've heard so far, but nonetheless, we feel it's an important piece that perhaps we can make a contribution to. So I suppose this piece is around placement, and what I mean by a national contribution is the development of quality assurance guidelines around placement. So as you know, there was a huge amount of disruption during COVID. We don't have to be reminded. I think professional practice placements and other types of work placements, traineeships, apprenticeships, research projects, public exhibitions, everything really suffered badly as a result of that. I think meeting any kind of placement requirements was the biggest challenge for everybody, particularly the HEIs. So at that time, the minister did ask us to become involved in, I suppose, talking to the HEIs, professional bodies, and others involved in placement. And as a result of that, I suppose we did have an opportunity to look at some really fascinating work and case studies that involved all sorts of alternative arrangements, conceptual frameworks, innovative solutions around placements. And some of those we managed to showcase at our HSI, our HEI professional body engagements. You'll remember some of you actually presented on that. Some of those particular case studies actually ended up being permanent solutions and are now more permanent features of the programs that they were associated with. So what we're really trying to do now is, I suppose what we're trying to do is gather all of that feedback, the feedback that we received during that time around those particular engagements, and also the series of joint webinars that we hosted with the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. And again, if you remember, that was around the assessment of work integrated learning with Dr. Geraldine O'Neill from UCD. The feedback that I suppose the main piece of feedback that we have received is that providers do have an appetite, as do professional bodies, in organising, I suppose, efforts towards a national set of quality assurance guidelines around placement. Now, the video that Catherine has done for us is quite cut down, but I suppose really this video is an interesting set of practice placement guidelines, and CORU were very much involved in consulting with over 17 professional, I suppose, registers and staff and placement practice professionals. So this is actually quite a broad stroke. It's a really good example of what's possible in terms of high-level guidance on placement. And as you know, CORU is Ireland's multi-professional health and social care regulator. Now, obviously, any kind of high-level guidance that QQI would produce in collaboration with yourselves, providers and professional bodies would have to be quite generic, non-prescriptive, and I suppose embrace many of the different aspects of the placement life cycle. And the example that Catherine is going to talk about here is along those lines. We do realise, of course, there's a huge diversity in the different forms of practice placement that are required. And, you know, one of those alone would be apprenticeship. Apprenticeship obviously is another form of integrated, I suppose, placement, work-based placement that we would need to consider as well. And QQI actually are carrying out a review of the quality and governance of consortia-led apprenticeship at the moment. So yeah, as I say, we've asked Catherine just to provide a sample of the engagement that CORU carried out as part of this. It was a research-based engagement, and as I say, it's non-prescriptive, it's quite generic, and it was across 17 different placements. So let's hear what she has to say.
So we would have engaged with the education providers at that time who were, I suppose, adapting to the changes required, whether that was a move to online learning and obviously adapting methodologies in terms of how practice placements were being provided. So each of the education providers who would have had a programme that was approved across the breadth of professions would have provided information to their registration board about the changes that they were making to their programs to assure that their graduates were able to attain those standards of proficiency, and that they would be safe to come on to a register and to practice future professionals in health and social care. And I suppose it was arising through that communication throughout 2020 with our education providers that I suppose we wanted to examine not just the immediate impact on the graduates of 2020, but what were some of the longer term impacts in terms of the students who were on those programs and who would have been, I suppose, going out in practice placement or whose placements might have been impacted. So we commissioned a piece of research. We had an independent researcher who came in to work, I suppose, with the executive in identifying a range of different stakeholders to interview as part of that process. So we very much targeted education providers themselves, those education providers who are implementing the changes to their programs across the breadth of professions that we regulate, as well as the practice placement providers. So where the practice placements, whether they're in hospitals or in private settings or in volunteer community settings, and as well as the professional bodies representing the different professions and other key stakeholders who were involved at that time around, I suppose, what was happening within higher education institutes, but also around the education and training of the future health and social care professions. So that independent research we would have written, I think, to over 26 institutes and asked them to identify someone appropriate to be interviewed. Those interviews were conducted by phone. Obviously, at the time, I think we had re-entered restrictions at that stage. And the providers provided a lot of, I suppose, really valuable information, not just, I suppose, about the challenges that they were currently experiencing in terms of, I suppose, the online learning, in terms of I suppose, the how quickly they had to change and adapt to facilitate students' attainment of the standards of proficiency, particularly where they may have lost certain practice placement sites. They had to source new placement sites to facilitate the students being able to achieve those standards. So that research gave us not just a really good insight into the challenges, but also, I suppose, the flexibility and the adaptability of the education providers themselves to creatively identify how they were adapting their programs to meet, I suppose, that new environment in which everyone was operating at the time. And it was from that research that we commissioned that the education providers themselves would have highlighted that they would benefit from additional guidance from CORU. We had very much communicated throughout 2020 within our criteria for education training program, within our standards, there's flexibility, I suppose, for education providers to determine how best they meet those standards. And the flexibility, I suppose, is around how they know their local context best, they know their practice placement providers best, they know the challenges they're experiencing best, and they know the curriculum design, how it delivers on the standard of proficiency, and what changes to that curriculum design might impact on the achievement of the standards. So while that had been communicated, I think the providers themselves felt it would be helpful to have more information around some of the different methodologies that have been used by providers themselves in adapting practice placements to ensure that the students were able to attain those standards. So that's really where the guidelines, I suppose, arose through that engagement and that piece of research we conducted. The clarity of the structure took a long time to get to, I will be honest. Because of the breadth of the professions that we regulate, the different professions, I suppose, have different standards, and how those standards are achieved and the impact on the placements was very different across the different professions. Some of the students were never not in practice placement, and for some, the practice placements were very much restricted during that period. So I suppose when we approached this, we very much approached it from what had education providers already told us they have been doing, but we also, I suppose, had connections with a breadth of our national and international regulatory colleagues, and all of those were undergoing similar issues across the world at the time, and we had, I suppose, access to that shared learning, but also access to the breadth of standards and guidelines and information that have been issued not just from regulators, but by a breadth of other bodies as well, to education and training providers on how to facilitate students during the pandemic, and how to ensure the students still achieve the required standards standards. So it was taking all of that information and it was trying to break that down into a generic methodology or example that could be relevant to our different professions. And when I say could be relevant, not all of the examples we had given would necessarily translate for every single profession, but it was trying to give an example of some of the things that we had heard from providers that they were doing. And that naturally broke down into pre-placement, what were the activities that they were doing to support students to prepare for them going on placement.
That's great, thanks. And that was Mairead Boland there interviewing Catherine. Now we've cut that video down significantly. It will be, the full video will be available. It's only 14 minutes long. It's really worth looking at. So you can see the rich contribution there from the providers particularly and the other actors involved. And Mairead's just going to put a slide up there now, which kind of captures the essence of this particular approach. So it's a recent set of guidance. It's well organized from the point of view there's very, very different themes. All of the different themes and the stages of placement are actually captured quite nicely there. You can see on-site, off-site, online, reflective studies. And we're talking about pre-planning and placement reflection. So there's a nice infrastructure there. The roles of the various actors are all very much involved and captured in the template itself. And it's certainly a partnership approach, which is quite critical around placement. And the guidance, as I said earlier, is generic and non-prescriptive. And a lot of what CORU have come up with here really is also reflected in Geraldine O'Neill's work on assessment for work assessment of work integrated learning. So there is an interesting correlation there. So this is a good basis, we feel, for starting a conversation, from which we would like to end up at a set of national quality assurance guidelines. There are many more examples out there. We'd like to hear from the professional bodies and providers on practice and guidance around placement with the recent learning. And we would also like to set up a small working group then just to start looking at those high level guidelines. And CORU and Geraldine O'Neill will be part of that working group so that they can bring their recent research and contribute to the development of those guidelines. And as I say, we'd love to start that conversation with you. So please get in touch with us. Thanks a lot. That's all I have to say. Thanks, Boyd.